My name is Lucia. I spent 5 years building a kingdom for a man who was secretly measuring my coffin. I thought I was a beloved wife, a daughter-in-law, and a sister to a cousin in need. But in the quiet corners of my own home, I was just a target. While I worked to provide us a future, my husband was weaving a web of lies with the woman he called his cousin, a woman who was carrying his child while wearing the clothes I bought for her. I ignored my parents' warnings for a love that turned out to be a ghost. I've tasted the bitterness of betrayal, and I've felt the crushing weight of a shattered heart. But tonight, I am standing in my truth. I am no longer the victim of their greed, I am the architect of my own freedom. We all have scars, and some stories are too heavy to carry alone. That is why I invite you to walk this journey with us. If you've ever felt broken, if you've ever needed the strength to start over, please join our family. Subscribe to Mother's Story and hit the notification bell. Let this be a place where we find our voices again, where we heal together, and where no woman ever has to suffer in silence. Welcome home. This is more than a channel, it is our sanctuary. The air in our master bedroom felt unusually heavy that afternoon, as if the very walls were sweating under the weight of a secret they were no longer willing to keep. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silk sheets cold beneath my palms, staring at the phone Sri had placed in my hands just moments ago. She had left the room without a word, her eyes darting to the floor, her face pale with a mixture of fear and pity. I knew her well enough to know that whatever was on that screen would be the end of the life I had meticulously built over the last 5 years. I hit play. The video was grainy, recorded from behind the kitchen door, but the voices were unmistakable. There sat my husband, David, the man I had supported, the man whose career I had built with my own sweat and my father's connections, and his mother, Jane. They were sitting at the dining table, the same table where we shared Sunday brunches and laughed about our future children. Jane's voice was the first to cut through the silence, sharp and predatory, lacking any of the motherly warmth she usually mimicked when I was in the room. She was leaning in, her eyes gleaming with a thirst for something that didn't belong to her. "We have to move faster, David," Jane hissed in the video. "If she suspects anything before the papers are signed, we get nothing. You've spent years playing the doting husband, don't let it go to waste now." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. My mind raced back to the investment documents David had been nudging me to sign for weeks. He told me they were for a new venture, a way for us to build our own legacy separate from my family's shadow. I had almost signed them yesterday, halted only by a sudden, inexplicable migraine. Now, I realized that migraine was perhaps my guardian angel whispering a warning. In the video, David sighed, a sound of weary arrogance that I had never heard him use toward me. He leaned back, crossing his arms, looking every bit the stranger. "I know, Mom. I'm working on it. Lucia is smart, but she's blinded by the fact that she thinks I actually love her. I just need a few more days to soften her up. Once she signs the asset transfer, her family's fortune becomes mine. She'll be left with the shell of a company and a house she can no longer afford." My heart didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces that cut into my chest with every breath. To hear him speak of me as a mark, a target to be liquidated, was a betrayal deeper than any physical blow. I had given him everything. When we met, he was a struggling architect with more debt than talent. I had used my influence, my capital, and my heart to turn him into the man the world saw today. And all this time, he was simply a parasite waiting for the right moment to drain its host. But as painful as the financial betrayal was, the video held a darker, more sickening truth. Jane leaned closer to her son, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made my stomach churn. "And what about Marina? You can't keep her hidden in the guest wing forever. Her belly isn't going to stay flat much longer, David. People will start to talk, and if Lucia finds out about the baby before the money is moved, everything crashes." David groaned, rubbing his temples. "Marina is being impatient. I told her she has to wait. I promised her that as soon as the divorce is finalized, after I have the money, I'll marry her. The child will have the life he deserves, with a father who is actually rich, not just a kept man living off his wife's scraps. The room seemed to tilt. Marina. David's cousin. The girl he had brought into our home 6 months ago, claiming she was a victim of a bad breakup and needed a place to recover. I had welcomed her with open arms. I had taken her shopping, comforted her during her depressive episodes, and treated her like the sister I never had. The thought of them together, in my house, while I was at the office working to provide for our future, made a wave of nausea wash over me. It wasn't just an affair, it was an incestuous, calculated invasion of my sanctuary. I gripped the phone so hard I thought the glass might snap. The cousin I had pitted was carrying my husband's child. The man I called my soulmate was a con artist. And the woman I called mom was the mastermind behind it all. They weren't just looking for a way out of the marriage, they were looking to destroy me, to leave me destitute and broken while they skipped away with the millions my father had spent a lifetime earning. I looked around the room, seeing it for the first time without the lens of affection. The expensive paintings on the wall, the designer furniture, the custom-built walk-in closet, it was all mine. David had contributed nothing but lies. He had lived like a king on a queen's treasury, and he had grown so bold in his greed that he thought he could take the throne too. The video ended, the screen going black, reflecting my own face back at me. I looked different. The softness in my eyes, the warmth that people often described as my best trait, was gone. In its place was a cold, flickering flame of pure, unadulterated rage. I realized then that if I cried, I would be doing exactly what they expected. They expected a broken woman, a victim who would wail and plead for an explanation. They wanted me weak so they could manipulate my guilt or my grief to get those signatures. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the manicured garden. I saw Marina sitting on a stone bench, her hand resting delicately on her still flat stomach, a small, triumphant smile on her face as she looked toward the house. She was waiting for him. She was waiting for my life to become hers. A quiet realization settled over me. They thought they were the hunters and I was the prey. They thought they had trapped me in a web of my own love and trust. But they had forgotten one crucial detail: I was the one who built this empire. I was the one with the keys to the kingdom. If David wanted to play the villain in a drama of his own making, I would ensure the ending was one he never saw coming. I wouldn't confront him tonight. I wouldn't scream or throw his clothes onto the lawn. That would be too simple, too quick. No, I wanted them to feel the slow, agonizing crawl of a life being dismantled piece by piece. I wanted Jane to watch her dreams of wealth vanish like smoke. I wanted Marina to realize that the rich man she stole was nothing more than a thief with a leaden heart. And David? I wanted to see the moment he realized that by reaching for everything, he had ensured he would end up with absolutely nothing. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, the kind of peace that only comes when you have nothing left to lose because you've already decided to burn the bridge behind you. I reached for my laptop and began to type a message to my lawyer, but then I paused. This required more than just a legal battle. This required a masterpiece of destruction. I would be the perfect wife for a little while longer. I would smile at Jane, I would be kind to Marina, and I would kiss David with the same lips that would eventually testify against him. I would let them think they were winning, right up until the moment the floor dropped out from under them. The war had started, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing by the rules of love. I was playing by the rules of survival. The breakfast table had become a stage where the most elaborate play in history was performed every morning. I sat at the head, the sunlight filtering through the crystal chandelier, casting mocking prisms of light across the porcelain plates. To my left sat David, hidden behind the morning financial news, pretending to be the diligent husband. Across from him was Marina, the wolf draped in the softest, most pathetic wool she could find. She sipped her herbal tea with a delicate, trembling hand, her eyes downcast as if the very weight of the world was too much for her fragile soul to bear. Looking at her, one would see a victim, a young woman cast out by a cruel ex-lover, seeking sanctuary with her only remaining kin. But I saw the predator beneath the silk robe I had bought for her, a woman who had not only shared my husband's bed but was currently growing his heir within her. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of lavender and betrayal. I watched her, really watched her, noticing the way her loose-fitting tunic draped a bit differently over her midsection today. She was clever, choosing styles that suggested a bohemian aesthetic rather than a secret, but the clock was ticking. I could see the subtle changes, the slight fullness in her face, the way she avoided the smell of the soft-boiled eggs I had served. Every time she winced at a scent or adjusted her seat, a bolt of electricity shot through my veins, a mixture of pure disgust and cold, calculating observation. I was no longer a wife sharing a meal, I was a scientist watching a parasite thrive inside a host. David finally looked up from his paper, his eyes lingering on Marina a fraction of a second too long. It was a look of ownership, a silent communication that excluded me entirely. He reached for the orange juice, his hand grazing hers accidentally as he set the pitcher back down. To anyone else, it was a clumsy movement in a crowded space. To me, it was a brand. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I forced a smile, the muscles in my cheeks aching from the effort of maintaining the mask. I asked her if she needed more honey for her tea, my voice as smooth as polished glass, hiding the jagged edges beneath. She thanked me with a soft, breathy whisper, her eyes flickering to mine for a moment with a spark of triumph she couldn't quite extinguish. She thought she was winning because she was in my house, eating my bread, and carrying my husband's child. She didn't realize she was merely being kept in a cage of my design. After breakfast, the domestic charade shifted to the garden. I moved to the sunroom, pretending to answer emails while I watched them through the glass. Jane, my mother-in-law, had arrived under the guise of checking on her dear niece. The three of them stood near the rose bushes, a tight, whispering knot of conspirators. Jane was the most animated, her hands moving in sharp, urgent gestures. Even through the double-paned glass, I could sense the frantic energy radiating from her. She kept glancing at Marina's stomach and then back at David, her lips moving in a rapid-fire sequence of commands. I knew what she was saying without hearing a single word. She was counting the weeks. She was demanding a timeline. The scandal of an illegitimate child would ruin her social standing, and more importantly, it would jeopardize the grand plan to absorb my assets. The pressure from Jane was becoming a tangible force in the house. Later that afternoon, I moved through the hallway, my footsteps silenced by the thick Persian rugs, and caught the tail end of a hushed argument in the library. Jane was cornering David, her voice a low, vibrating hiss that carried through the mahogany door. She spoke of legalities and the necessity of the transition. She told him that Marina couldn't stay a cousin for much longer. The belly would show, the lies would thin, and the window of opportunity to claim my fortune before the incident became public was closing. David's responses were muffled, defensive, filled with the frustration of a man who had promised the world to two different women and was now being crushed by the weight of his own duplicity. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, a ghost in my own mansion, listening to them discuss my replacement as if I were a piece of furniture to be moved into storage. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Marina joined them, her voice rising in a rare moment of petulance. She wanted the ring, she wanted the status, and most of all, she wanted the security of my name. She was tired of playing the part of the grieving relative. She wanted to be the lady of the house. I leaned my head against the cool wallpaper, closing my eyes, imagining the look on her face when she realized that the status she craved was built on a foundation of sand I was already beginning to wash away. What hurt the most wasn't the plan to marry her, it was the casual intimacy they shared when they thought I wasn't looking. I saw it in the kitchen that evening, David leaning over her, his breath on her neck as he helped her reach a glass, his hand resting on her waist with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. It was a touch that belonged to me, a gesture of comfort that he had stolen from our marriage and gifted to a woman who had systematically dismantled my trust. I watched from the darkened pantry, my heart a cold stone in my chest. They looked like a couple. They looked like a family. They were already living a life that didn't include me, even as I paid for the very roof over their heads. Jane's presence acted like a catalyst, turning the simmering tension into a boiling pot of urgency. She spent the evening counseling me on the virtues of a simpler life, subtly suggesting that perhaps managing such a large estate was too much for a woman of my sensitivities. She spoke of the peace I might find in a smaller home, perhaps away from the city, while her eyes roamed the expensive crown molding and the antique furniture, already mentally tagging items for her son's new life. Every word out of her mouth was a poisonous barb wrapped in a velvet glove. She was the architect of my ruin, the woman who had coached her son to be a thief of hearts and fortunes. As the night settled over the house, the wolf retreated to her den in the guest wing, and David climbed into our bed, smelling of the expensive cologne I had bought him and the faint, lingering scent of Marina's lavender soap. He reached for my hand, his touch oily and deceptive, and I had to pray for the strength not to recoil. I let him pull me close, my body rigid, my eyes wide in the darkness. I could hear the house settling, the faint creaks of the wood sounding like the groans of a dying animal. They thought they had me surrounded. Jane with her demands, Marina with her growing bump, and David with his forged affection. They were the wolves, and they believed I was the lamb, blind and shivering in the corner. But as I lay there, listening to David's rhythmic, dishonest breathing, I realized that wolves only win when the prey is afraid. I wasn't afraid. I was a mapmaker, and I was currently charting the exact coordinates of their downfall. I would let Jane push for the wedding. I would let Marina dream of her white dress and my stolen throne. I would let them think the sheep was ready for the slaughter, while I sharpened the blade in the silence of my own heart. The performance would continue, but the script was no longer theirs to write. The drive to my parents' house was a blur of gray asphalt and stinging tears that I refused to let fall until I was safely away from the surveillance of my own home. I left the mansion, the hollow, gilded cage where David and Marina whispered in corners, feeling like I was escaping a crime scene. As I pulled into the familiar cobblestone driveway of my childhood home, the scent of blooming jasmine and damp earth hit me, a sensory slap that reminded me of a time when my heart was whole and my judgment wasn't clouded by the intoxicating fumes of a con artist's charm. My mother was in the garden, her sun hat tilted forward as she tended to her orchids with a tenderness I had once assumed was universal. Seeing her there, so unchanged and so pure, made the knot in my chest tighten until I could barely breathe. She looked up and smiled, that radiant, knowing smile that had always been my North Star. I forced my features into a mask of casual daughterly affection, a performance that was becoming a second skin. I stepped out of the car, smoothed my expensive silk skirt, bought with money David was currently trying to steal, and walked toward her. We sat on the veranda, sipping tea that tasted like home and tradition. My mother didn't say much, she had always been a master of the pregnant pause, waiting for me to fill the silence. As I watched her pour the tea, my mind drifted back 5 years, to the day I brought David home for the first time. I remembered my father's stony silence during dinner and my mother's polite, yet guarded, questions. Later that night, in this very house, they had sat me down. My father, with his decades of business acumen, had seen right through David's polished exterior. He told me that David's ambition felt hungry, not for achievement, but for acquisition. My mother had been more direct about Jane, warning me that a woman who treated her son like a retirement plan would never treat a daughter-in-law like family. I had laughed it off. I had been so arrogant in my blind love, convinced that I knew better than the people who had raised me. I told them they were being old-fashioned, that they didn't see the vulnerability in David that I saw. I mistook his desperation for passion and his mother's interference for devotion. Now, sitting across from the woman who had tried to save me from myself, the weight of my own stupidity was a physical burden. I wanted to throw myself into her lap and howl like a wounded animal. I wanted to admit that they were right, every single, painful word they had uttered had come true with a vengeance I could have never imagined. Instead, I talked about the weather. I talked about a fictional project at the office. I lied with a proficiency that would have made David proud, and that realization made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't tell them yet. My father was still in Singapore on business, and my mother's heart was too fragile to bear the news of my impending ruin without the full picture of my counterattack. If I told her now, she would insist I move back immediately. She would call the lawyers, and the quiet, surgical strike I was planning would turn into a messy, public brawl that might allow David to slip through the cracks. I needed him to think I was still the blind, doting fool until the very second the trap snapped shut. "You look tired, Lucia," my mother said softly, her eyes scanning my face with a precision that made me tremble. She reached out, her hand calloused from gardening but infinitely gentle, and brushed a stray hair from my forehead. "The city life, the business, it takes a toll. Don't forget that you have a sanctuary here. You don't have to carry everything alone." I managed a tight nod, my throat closing up. I excused myself, claiming I needed to use the restroom, but instead, I ducked into my old bedroom. It was exactly as I had left it, the faded posters, the shelves of books, the air of untapped potential. I shut the door and collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in a pillow to muffle the sobs that finally broke through. I wept for the girl I used to be, the one who believed in fairy tales and fixed broken men. I wept for the 5 years I had wasted building a pedestal for a man who wanted to bury me beneath it. The regret was a cold, drowning ocean, and for a few minutes, I let myself sink. Every warning I had ignored echoed in the silence of the room. My father's voice, warning me about David's family's reputation for social climbing by any means. My mother's gentle nudge to look at how David spoke to those beneath him. I had been so blinded by the way he looked at me, or the way I thought he looked at me, that I had ignored the red flags that were practically screaming in my face. I had handed a thief the keys to my vault and acted surprised when the gold started to disappear. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 10 minutes, I stood up. I went to the vanity and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red, but the fire behind them had cooled into something harder, something permanent. I splashed cold water on my face, erasing the traces of the victim. The Lucia who had entered this room was a daughter drowning in regret, the Lucia leaving it was a general returning to the front lines. I walked back out to the veranda, my posture straight, my voice steady. I thanked my mother for the tea and promised to visit again soon, perhaps when my father returned. She watched me walk to the car, her expression unreadable, but I sensed she knew a storm was coming. She just didn't know I was the one bringing the lightning. As I drove back toward the mansion, back toward David's false smiles and Marina's parasitic presence, I realized that the blind love that had nearly destroyed me was officially dead. In its place was a clear, cold vision of the future. I had ignored my parents' warnings once, and I had paid the price in blood and tears. I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. I would stay strong, I would play the part, and I would ensure that by the time David and Jane realized I was no longer their puppet, I would be the one holding the scissors to their strings. The echoes of the past were no longer a source of shame, they were the fuel for my fire. I was going back to a house full of enemies, but for the first time in years, I wasn't walking in as a wife. I was walking in as the architect of their demise. The kitchen felt like a laboratory of cold justice as I stood by the marble countertop, the steam from the espresso machine rising like a ghostly veil between my old life and the one I was currently forging. I held a small, amber vial in my hand, a substance I had spent hours researching, not to kill, but to reveal. It was a potent metabolic stimulant, something that would flush the skin, accelerate the heart, and create an intolerable, restless heat within the body. It was a physical manifestation of the feverish lies David had been feeding me, and tonight, I was going to serve it back to him in a porcelain cup. I watched the dark liquid swirl into the mug, the rich aroma of Arabica usually a symbol of comfort, now a bitter vehicle for my first strike. My hands didn't shake. The tremors of the previous week had hardened into a steady, surgical precision. I added the drops, watching them disappear into the blackness of the coffee, invisible yet transformative. I was no longer the wife who lived to please him, I was the ghost in the machine, the architect of a slow-burning ruin. David entered the room, loosening his tie, his face wearing that practiced mask of professional exhaustion that I once found so endearing. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and arrogant, and planted a dry, habitual kiss on my cheek. It felt like the touch of a reptile. I handed him the cup, my smile a masterpiece of deception, and watched as he took a long, appreciative sip. I told him he looked tired and that the coffee would help him settle in for the evening. He thanked me, his eyes already drifting toward the hallway where Marina was likely waiting, and I felt a dark, cold spark of satisfaction. We sat in the living room for a while, the silence between us stretched thin like a wire about to snap. I pretended to read a book, but my eyes never left him. The transformation began slowly. First, a light sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He began to fidget, tugging at his collar, his breathing becoming shallow and rhythmic. He complained about the humidity, claiming the air conditioning must be failing, but I merely looked up and noted that I felt quite comfortable. I watched his pulse throb in his neck, a frantic, trapped bird, as the fever I had given him began to take hold. He couldn't sit still. His leg bounced, his eyes darted toward the stairs, and he wiped his palms on his trousers repeatedly. The restlessness I had engineered was working. It was an itch he couldn't scratch, a heat that made his skin feel like a suit that was 3 sizes too small. He finally stood up, his face flushed a deep, unnatural crimson, and muttered something about taking a cold shower and checking on Marina's well-being before bed. I didn't look up from my book as he left the room, but the moment his footsteps faded on the stairs, I set the book down and reached for my phone. I moved with the silence of a shadow, my bare feet sinking into the plush carpet of the upstairs hallway. The house felt different tonight, as if the very air was holding its breath. I approached the guest wing, the area I had once so generously designated for a cousin in distress. The door to Marina's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling out into the dark corridor. They were so confident in their victory, so sure of my blindness, that they hadn't even bothered to turn the lock. I positioned myself at the crack of the door, my heart a steady, cold drum in my chest. I didn't feel the frantic pulse that David was currently enduring. I felt only a sharp, crystalline clarity. I raised my phone, the lens peering through the gap like the unblinking eye of a judge. Through the sliver of space, I saw them. David was sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt discarded, his chest heaving as he complained about the heat. Marina was there, her hands, the same hands that had accepted my gifts and my kindness, stroking his back with a predatory grace. They weren't speaking of family or cousins. They were speaking of me in the past tense. They were laughing quietly about the signatures they still needed, their voices dripping with a casual cruelty that made my blood run cold despite the rage. I hit the record button. The digital screen captured it all, the illicit touch, the shared glances of conspirators, the unmistakable intimacy of a couple who had long ago discarded any pretense of morality. I watched through the screen as David pulled her closer, his voice a low, desperate mumble fueled by the stimulant I had given him. He was seeking solace in the very betrayal that would be his undoing. Every second of footage was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. Every frame was a piece of ironclad evidence that would ensure he left this house with nothing but the clothes on his back and the shame of his choices. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, an invisible witness to my own replacement. It was a strange, agonizing sensation, to watch the man you loved become a monster in high definition. But as the minutes ticked by, the pain began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of power. I was no longer the victim of their secret, I was the owner of it. I possessed the truth, captured in pixels and light, and that truth was more valuable than any asset David was trying to steal. I pulled back from the door just as their whispers grew more fervent, my movements as precise and silent as a ghost's. I retreated down the hallway, the phone clutched in my hand like a weapon. Back in the safety of my bedroom, I locked the door and sat in the darkness, the blue light of the phone screen illuminating my face. I watched the video back once, my features set in stone. It was perfect. The lighting was sufficient, the faces were clear, and the betrayal was undeniable. I thought of Jane, downstairs in her room, likely dreaming of the jewelry and the bank accounts she thought were within her reach. I thought of David, currently trapped in a biological and moral fever of his own making. And I thought of Marina, the woman who believed she had won the prize. They were all so small, so remarkably transparent in their greed. I uploaded the file to a secure cloud server, sent a copy to my lawyer with a brief, emotionless note, and then I lay down on the bed. For the first time in months, I didn't cry. I didn't feel the hollow ache of loss. Instead, I felt a grim, steady satisfaction. The bitter taste of truth was a flavor I was beginning to enjoy. I had served David a cup of fire, and in his desperation to put it out, he had handed me the keys to his destruction. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a house that still looked like a home, but the foundations were already gone. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the house wrap around me, a silent predator waiting for the dawn. The morning sun hit the driveway at an angle that made the silver paint of the Grand Touring sedan sparkle with an offensive brilliance. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, a car that whispered of status, power, and the kind of effortless wealth David had spent 5 years pretending he was born into. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the breakfast nook, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and watched the light dance across the hood. I remembered the day I bought it. It was a gift for our 3rd anniversary, or rather, a gift I had given him to celebrate a promotion I had secured for him through my father's contacts. He had wept with joy that day, promising me the world. Now, looking at it, I only saw a 4-wheeled monument to my own gullibility. I set the tea down on the marble counter, the click of the porcelain echoing in the silent kitchen. The house felt like a hollow shell, a stage waiting for the actors to take their places for another day of deceit. Upstairs, David was likely preening in front of the mirror, adjusting a silk tie I had chosen for him, while Marina probably lay in the guest bed, dreaming of the day she would replace me. They were comfortable. They were settled. They believed the foundations of this life were solid because they were built on my love, which they considered a limitless resource. They didn't realize that my love had a shut-off valve, and I had turned it until it snapped. The tow truck arrived at precisely 8:30 a.m., just as I had arranged. I had spent the previous afternoon in a cold, sterile office at a high-end dealership, signing away the vehicle to a buyer who didn't ask questions about why a woman of my stature was liquidating a car so abruptly. The paperwork was simple. The title bore my name, my maiden name, a detail David had overlooked in his rush to claim the keys years ago. He had always been so focused on the possession that he ignored the fine print of ownership. I stood on the porch, my arms crossed against the morning chill, and watched the driver secure the hooks to the undercarriage. There was a strange, rhythmic beauty to the process, the grinding of the winch, the slow tilting of the flatbed. It felt like a surgical amputation of a limb I no longer needed. The car didn't belong in my driveway anymore, just as David didn't belong in my life. As the truck pulled away, leaving nothing but 2 faint tire marks on the pristine pavers, I felt a surge of adrenaline so sharp it made my fingertips tingle. It was the first time in weeks that I felt I was breathing air that wasn't recycled through their lies. I returned to the kitchen and waited. I pulled out my tablet and began reviewing the daily reports from the office, pretending to be the diligent CEO, the perfect wife, the woman who knew nothing. 10 minutes later, I heard David's footsteps on the stairs, brisk, confident, the sound of a man who owned the world. He entered the kitchen, whistling a tune I didn't recognize, and reached for a piece of toast. He looked at me, giving that shallow, practiced smile that reached his lips but never his eyes. He asked if I had seen his keys. I simply pointed to the bowl on the counter. He grabbed them, tucked his leather briefcase under his arm, and walked toward the door leading to the garage. I didn't follow him. I stayed exactly where I was, my eyes fixed on the screen of my tablet, counting the seconds in the silence of my mind. 1, 2, 3. The silence was broken by the sound of the garage door rumbling open. Then, nothing. A long pause of confusion. Then the sound of the door from the garage to the driveway swinging wide. I heard his frantic footsteps on the pavers, the sound of a man running in circles, trying to make sense of a reality that had suddenly shifted. A moment later, he burst back into the house, his face a mask of panicked disbelief. His tie was slightly crooked now, the confident veneer beginning to crack at the edges. He began to stammer, his voice rising in pitch as he asked where the car was. He spoke of theft, of calling the police, of a security breach. He was pacing the kitchen floor, his hands gesturing wildly at the empty space outside the window. He looked at me, expecting me to join his panic, expecting me to be the frantic wife who would call the insurance company and soothe his bruised ego. I didn't move. I didn't even look up at first. I waited until his shouting reached a crescendo, until he was hovering over me, demanding an explanation for the disappearance of his pride and joy. I slowly set the tablet down and leaned back in the chair, meeting his gaze with a level of coldness that seemed to physically push him back. My voice, when I spoke, was a whisper of ice, devoid of the warmth he had spent years exploiting. I told him the car hadn't been stolen. I told him I had sold it. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The panic in his eyes shifted into a raw, ugly rage, the kind of anger a child feels when a toy is taken away. He began to scream about his rights, about how he drove that car every day, about how I had no business touching his things without his permission. He called my actions impulsive, insane, a betrayal of our partnership. He spoke as if I had stolen something from him, as if I were the villain in this domestic drama. I watched the veins throb in his neck, the flush of his skin, the way his hands shook as he tried to exert a dominance he no longer possessed. He was a small man in a large room, and for the first time, he looked exactly like what he was, a parasite that had grown too fat on its host. When he finally paused for breath, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reminded him, with a clinical precision that cut through his hysterics, that the car was registered in my name. I reminded him that every payment, every insurance premium, and every drop of fuel had been provided by my accounts. I told him that as the legal owner, I had found the vehicle to be a redundant expense, an unnecessary luxury for a man who seemed to be losing his sense of direction. I watched the realization sink in, not the realization of his affair, but the realization that his comfort was entirely dependent on my whim. He was a man who lived on borrowed time and drove on a borrowed title. The look of pure, impotent fury on his face was the most honest expression I had seen on him in years. He tried to argue, to claim that we were a unit, that what was mine was his. I nearly laughed at the irony of it. Instead, I simply picked up my tablet and walked toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the middle of the kitchen, clutching the keys to a car that was already miles away. I didn't look back to see him collapse into a chair, his head in his hands. I didn't care. As I climbed the stairs, I realized that the luxury wasn't the car. The luxury was the power to take it back. The luxury was the silence that followed his scream. This was only the beginning of the vanishing. Piece by piece, I was going to erase the world I had built for him until he was left standing in the cold, naked and alone. The air in my corner office was filtered and cool, smelling of expensive parchment and the faint, metallic scent of the high-end printer that had been churning out documents for the last hour. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city hummed with a frantic energy that felt entirely alien to the stillness I had cultivated within these four walls. I sat at my mahogany desk, a solid, unyielding slab of wood that felt like the only thing keeping me grounded, and stared at the stack of folders Indri had just placed before me. Indri stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly, her usual professional composure fractured by a look of deep, simmering concern. She had been with me since the beginning, a woman who saw the company not just as a workplace, but as a living entity that we had nurtured together. I reached for the first folder, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic tabs. For years, I had trusted David with the operational side of the business, believing that his ambition was fueled by a desire to prove himself worthy of the position I had given him. I had handed him the keys to the treasury because I thought we were building a future together. Now, as I opened the first spreadsheet, the numbers began to tell a story that had nothing to do with growth or investment. They were the footprints of a thief. The paper trail was a messy, arrogant map of greed. It started small, disguised consulting fees to shell companies that had no physical address, no employees, and no purpose other than to act as a funnel. But as I flipped through the pages, the numbers grew, swelling like a malignant tumor. I watched as millions flowed out of the corporate accounts and into the shadows. I saw wire transfers that coincided perfectly with the weeks Marina had needed to go away for her health. I saw payments to high-end boutiques and luxury resorts that I had never visited. It was a digital diary of his double life, written in the cold, hard ink of my company's earnings. Indri stepped closer, her voice a low, steady murmur as she pointed out the most egregious discrepancies. She had been digging through the back-end servers for days, matching David's corporate credit card statements with private bank accounts he thought were invisible. The total was staggering, 300 million. It wasn't just a loss, it was a systematic gutting of the company's reserves. As I traced the final destination of several large transfers, my heart turned to ice. The money hadn't just gone to Marina, it had gone to Jane. My mother-in-law's long-standing debts, the ones she had claimed were settled years ago, had been paid off with my employees' bonuses and my father's legacy. The realization was a physical weight, pressing the air from my lungs. David hadn't just cheated on me in our bed, he had cheated me at my desk. He had looked me in the eye every morning, kissed my cheek, and then spent his afternoons figuring out how much more he could bleed from the business before I noticed the pallor of its accounts. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I looked at his signature on the bottom of a fraudulent invoice. It was a graceful script, full of loops and flourishes, the signature of a man who believed he was too clever to ever be caught. I spent the next 2 hours in total silence, cross-referencing every document until the truth was ironclad. There would be no room for excuses, no space for the misunderstandings he was so fond of manufacturing. Every cent was accounted for, every lie was documented. I looked at Indri, and without a word, she knew what had to be done. She gathered the papers back into the folders with a grim efficiency. We were no longer just colleagues, we were a cleanup crew removing a toxin from the system. The door to my office swung open without a knock, and David walked in, radiating that same unearned confidence that had once fooled me into thinking he was a leader. He looked annoyed, his mouth already forming a complaint, likely about the car I had sold or the disrespect he felt he was receiving from the staff. He didn't see the folders. He didn't see the coldness in my eyes. He saw only the woman he thought he could still manipulate with a well-timed pout or a lecture on partnership. I didn't let him speak. I simply slid the final summary report across the mahogany surface. I watched as his eyes dropped to the paper, watched the way the color drained from his face as he recognized the numbers. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a frantic, darting look of a cornered animal. He began to stammer, his voice a high-pitched frantic mess, trying to weave a new lie on the spot. He spoke of short-term loans and reimbursements, his hands shaking as he reached for the paper as if he could crumble the truth into a ball and throw it away. I cut him off with a single, sharp gesture. The dialogue I had imagined for this moment, the screaming, the accusations, felt unnecessary. The numbers were louder than any shout. I told him he was finished. I told him his access to the building had been revoked, his accounts frozen, and that the only reason the police weren't already waiting in the lobby was that I wanted him to walk out of this building with the full weight of his failure on his shoulders. I watched him shrink, the expensive suit suddenly looking like it belonged to a much smaller, much weaker man. He tried to mention Marina, to use her delicate condition as a shield, but the mention of her name only hardened my resolve. He left without his briefcase, escorted by the security guards I had summoned with a silent buzz of the intercom. The silence that followed his departure was the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. I turned to Indri, who was already standing by the door with Putra, one of our most senior and most overlooked managers. Putra was a man of quiet integrity, a man who had watched David's rise with a silent, professional disdain. I looked at him, a man who had earned his place through merit, not through the bed of the CEO. I didn't offer a long speech. I simply told Putra that the position of general manager was now vacant and that I needed someone who understood that a company's wealth was a trust, not a personal playground. I watched the surprise and the solemnity on his face as he accepted the responsibility. It was a surgical replacement, a swift removal of the rot and the immediate installation of a healthy heart. As Putra and Indri left to begin the massive task of auditing the damage, I sat back in my chair and looked out at the city. The paper trail had led to a cliff, and I had been the one to give David the final push. I felt no guilt, only the cold, refreshing clarity of a woman who was finally taking back the keys to her own kingdom. The arrival of my father back on home soil felt like the shifting of tectonic plates, a sudden stabilization of a world that had been spinning out of control for weeks. When I saw him stepping out of the arrival's gate, his posture as unyielding as a mountain despite the long flight from Singapore, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. He was the man who had built the empire David tried to scavenge, a titan of industry who moved with a quiet, lethal grace that my husband had never managed to replicate. As our eyes met, I saw the immediate flicker of concern in his sharp, discerning gaze. He didn't need to hear the words to know that the daughter he had warned was now standing in the wreckage of the very life he had predicted. We didn't speak of it in the car. We didn't speak of it as we entered the quiet sanctuary of my parents' study, a room that smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco, and decades of iron-fisted decisions. It was only when the door was firmly shut and the tea had been poured that the dam finally broke. I sat across from him, surrounded by the trophies of his success, and laid out the ugly, jagged truth. I told him everything, the video from Back-3, the metabolic fever I had used to catch them, the sold car, the 300 million stolen from the company, and the ultimate insult, the cousin who was carrying the heir to a stolen throne. I watched his face. For a moment, I saw the raw, primal rage of a father whose cub had been hunted by a scavenger. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair, and for a second, I feared the sheer intensity of his anger would shatter the quiet of the room. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell me, "I told you so," though the right to say it was his by every metric of reality. Instead, he stood up, walked around the desk, and placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. It was the shield I had abandoned for 5 years, and the moment it touched me, the last of my prideful walls crumbled. I wept, not out of weakness, but out of the sheer relief of being found. The transition from fury to cold, calculated strategy was instantaneous. My father was not a man of impulsive outbursts, he was a man of long-term chess. He sat back down and began to dismantle the situation with the same clinical precision he used to take over failing competitors. He looked at the evidence I had gathered, the videos, the financial audits, the trail of lies, and I saw a grim smile of pride touch his lips. He told me that I had done well to gather the stones, but now, he was going to show me how to build the catapult. He didn't want a simple divorce. He didn't want a quiet settlement. He wanted a total, public erasure of David's existence from the social and professional fabric of the city. We began to coordinate with the intelligence I had received from Back-3, who was now my most valuable asset inside the lion's den. She had overheard Jane and David whispering about a retreat to Marina's home village. They were planning a secret, traditional wedding, believing that once the knot was tied and the child was legitimate in the eyes of their community, they would have a stronger moral claim to the family assets they thought they were getting. They believed they were slipping away into the night to start their new life on my dime. My father tapped a gold pen against the mahogany desk, a rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. He told me that we wouldn't stop the wedding. In fact, we would let them spend every last cent they had left on the celebration. We would let them invite their friends, their family, and their witnesses. We would let David stand at the altar, feeling like a man who had successfully outmaneuvered the great Lucia. We would let him feel the peak of his triumph, because that was the only height from which the fall would be truly fatal. The shield of a father wasn't just about protection, it was about the heavy, crushing weight of retribution. He began making calls, to the chief of police, to the high court judges he had known for 30 years, and to the private investigators who would track David's every movement toward that village. He instructed me to remain the distraught but distracted wife for a few more days, to keep the illusion of my ignorance alive so that David wouldn't panic and flee. I was to be the bait, and he would be the trap. I watched him work, realizing that this was the education I had missed while I was busy trying to save a man who was inherently unsavable. My father showed me that power isn't just about owning things, it's about the ability to dictate the reality of others. He told me that by the time we were finished, David wouldn't just be poor, he would be a pariah. He would be a man without a name, without a home, and without a future. And Jane? He had a special kind of silence prepared for her, a total cutoff from every social circle she had spent her life trying to infiltrate. The strategy was laid out like a military campaign. We would strike at the height of the wedding ceremony. I would arrive not as a weeping victim, but as the owner of the life David was trying to steal. We would bring the law, we would bring the truth, and we would bring the finality of a divorce that was already being fast-tracked through the system thanks to my father's influence. The secret wedding was going to be the most public execution of a reputation in the history of that village. As I left my father's house that evening, the air felt cooler, sharper, and full of promise. I was no longer a woman alone in a darkened room, clutching a phone with a heartbreaking video. I was a part of a lineage of strength. The fear that had lived in my chest for weeks had been replaced by a cold, dark anticipation. My father had provided the shield, but he had also handed me the sword. David thought he was escaping to a new beginning with his pregnant mistress and his conniving mother, but he was actually marching toward a cliff. I drove back to the mansion, looking at the darkened windows where my enemy slept, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to hide. I felt like a predator returning to a nest that it was about to incinerate. The trap was set, the shield was up, and the hunter was about to become the hunted. The law office of Mr. Arya was a fortress of mahogany and silence, a place where lives were dismantled and rebuilt with the stroke of a fountain pen. As I sat in the plush leather chair, the scent of old paper and expensive ink filling my senses, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Across from me, Mr. Arya, a man whose reputation for legal lethality was matched only by his discretion, pored over the evidence my father and I had provided. The video of the infidelity, the spreadsheets detailing the $300 million in embezzled funds, and the witness statements from the office staff lay scattered across his desk like the pieces of a gruesome puzzle. I watched him, my hand steady in my lap, waiting for the moment the law would finally align with my reality. There was no room for sentimentality in this room. We were here for a surgical extraction. I had made one thing very clear to Mr. Arya: David must not know. I wanted the divorce to be a ghost in the system, moving silently through the corridors of the court while David was occupied with his own delusions of grandeur. My husband, or the man who still legally bore that title, was currently miles away in Marina's village, caught in a whirlwind of wedding preparations. He thought he was being clever, sneaking away under the guise of escorting his mother home, but in reality, he was simply stepping into a vacuum I had created for him. The process was a masterclass in the power of influence, as my father liked to call it. Because David had effectively abandoned our primary residence to hide in the countryside, and because I had the financial and social capital to expedite the proceedings, the gears of justice began to turn with unnatural speed. We arranged for the legal summons to be sent to my parents' address, ensuring that David would never see a single envelope or hear a single whisper from a process server. I felt a grim sort of joy in the irony of it. For years, David had used my resources to hide his secrets. Now, I was using those same resources to hide the fact that I was already erasing him from my life. The first hearing was a cold, clinical affair. I stood before the judge, my father a silent, towering presence at my side, and presented the reality of a marriage that had become a crime scene. There was no need for mediation, no room for irreconcilable differences as a mere formality. This was a case of systematic fraud, emotional abuse, and blatant infidelity. I listened to Mr. Arya's voice, steady and devoid of emotion, as he laid out the facts of David's betrayal. It felt as though I was listening to the obituary of a woman I used to be. Every word spoken in that courtroom was a shovel of dirt on the grave of my former naivety. While I was navigating the hushed halls of the courthouse, David was likely haggling over the price of a wedding tent or smiling at Marina as they picked out traditional fabrics for their ceremony. I could almost picture him, his chest puffed out with the pride of a man who thought he had won. He believed he was the architect of his own destiny, moving toward a new life with a pregnant mistress and a stolen fortune. He didn't realize that every step he took toward that village was a step deeper into a trap. He thought he was preparing for a yes, unaware that the law had already given him a final, resounding no. The speed at which the decree was finalized was almost jarring. In the world of high-stakes law, when the evidence is absolute and the influence is significant, the typical months of waiting can be compressed into weeks. I spent those days in a state of heightened awareness, playing the role of the busy CEO whenever David called to check in with his fake, oily concern. I kept my voice level, my answers short, letting him believe I was simply buried in work and too distracted to notice his absence. Every time I hung up the phone, I felt a fresh surge of disgust, followed by a cold, sharpening anticipation. Then came the day I had been waiting for. I returned to Mr. Arya's office, the city outside sweltering under a relentless sun. He held out a document, the paper heavy and crisp, bearing the official seal of the court. I took it from him, my fingers tracing the embossed stamp that made it real. It was the divorce decree. I was no longer Lucia, the wife of David Pratama. I was Lucia, a woman who stood alone and unburdened. The legal bond that had tied me to a parasite for 5 years had been severed with a precision that left no jagged edges. I stood by the window of the law office, looking out at the skyline, the document clutched to my chest like a shield. The weight of it was incredible, not heavy, but solid. It was the second hook in the tragedy I was writing for David. He was currently preparing to stand before a village elder and a crowd of witnesses to commit bigamy, thinking he was legally tethered to my wealth. He was counting on our marriage to be his safety net, his golden parachute. He had no idea that the parachute had been cut away while he was still midair. The psychological victory felt even sweeter than the legal one. I held the power to let him go through with it. I could have stopped him weeks ago, but that would have been too merciful. I wanted him to say those vows. I wanted him to believe, for one final, fleeting moment, that he had successfully replaced me. I wanted him to stand there in his wedding finery, surrounded by the people he had lied to, and feel the absolute peak of his triumph. Because only then would I reveal that the man standing at that altar was a stranger to me, a man with no claim to my name, my house, or my future. I walked out of the office and into the bright, blinding light of the afternoon, the decree tucked safely in my bag. My father was waiting in the car, his expression unreadable, but I saw the slight nod of his head as I got in. We didn't need to say a word. The secret verdict was a weapon of absolute finality. David was marching toward a celebration, but I was bringing the funeral. As we began the long drive toward the village where the wedding was to take place, I felt a strange, quiet peace. I was a woman holding a piece of paper that had changed the world, and for the first time in a long time, the air I breathed felt entirely my own. David was about to say I do to a life that had already been taken away from him, and I wouldn't trade the look on his face for all the gold he had tried to steal. The drive to the village was long, a winding journey through emerald rice fields and jagged hills that seemed to lead to the very edge of the world. It was the kind of place where secrets were supposed to stay buried, a remote sanctuary where David believed he could reinvent his life far from the reach of the empire he had tried to dismantle. I sat in the back of my father's black SUV, the leather cool against my skin, watching the dust kick up behind us like the ghosts of my past 5 years. Beside me, my mother gripped my hand, her silent strength a steadying force. Behind us, 2 police cruisers followed at a discreet distance, their lights dark for now, waiting for the signal to end the hollow pageant David had orchestrated. As we approached the heart of the village, the sound of traditional music began to bleed through the closed windows, a rhythmic, festive beat that made my stomach churn with a mixture of disgust and cold anticipation. They had decorated the communal hall with bright fabrics and fragrant jasmine, a mockery of the sanctity they were pretending to uphold. I looked at the divorce decree resting in my lap, the ink dry and the seal official. David was about to enter a union built on the ruins of mine, unaware that the foundation was already ash. We stepped out of the car, the humid air thick with the scent of wood smoke and celebration. I adjusted my kabaya, a garment of grace and tradition that I wore today as a suit of armor. My father walked at my side, his presence a silent declaration of war. We moved toward the hall, our footsteps steady on the packed earth. The villagers had gathered in their best clothes, their faces bright with the excitement of a wedding. They didn't know the truth. They saw a bereaved cousin being cared for by a noble man. They didn't see the vultures in silk. The ceremony was reaching its peak. I stood at the entrance of the hall, hidden by the shadows of the doorway, and watched. There sat David, looking every bit the triumphant groom in his intricate batik. Beside him, Marina wore a white veil that was meant to symbolize a purity she had discarded long ago. Her hand rested on her lap, occasionally moving to her midsection in a gesture of feigned modesty that made me want to scream. Jane was there too, sitting in the place of honor, her face glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who thought she had finally secured her retirement at my expense. The village elder was speaking the final words of the union, the crowd leaning in to witness the sacred moment. It was exactly as my father had predicted, David was at the height of his pride. I waited for the silence that followed the vows, the moment where the community was supposed to welcome the new couple. That was when I stepped into the light. The music didn't stop immediately, but the atmosphere changed the second I crossed the threshold. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd as they noticed the strangers at the door. I walked down the center aisle, my eyes fixed on David. I watched the blood drain from his face, his confident posture collapsing into a frantic, twitching mess. He tried to stand, his mouth opening to say something, likely another lie, another desperate attempt to regain control. I didn't give him the chance. The dialogue in the room was sparse, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of my presence. I didn't need to shout. I simply held up the divorce decree for everyone to see. I spoke to the villagers, my voice low but carrying with the authority of a woman who had been cheated of her life but not her dignity. I told them that the man standing before them was not a grieving widower or a noble savior. I told them he was a thief who had stolen 300 million from the very people who fed him. I told them that the woman beneath the veil was not his cousin, but a predator who had shared my bed while I was at work building the house they lived in. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. In a community where family and honor were everything, the idea of a man stealing from his wife and fathering a child with his cousin was an unforgivable taboo. I saw the villagers' faces shift from joy to a dark, simmering horror. They looked at David and Marina not as neighbors, but as a sickness in their midst. Marina began to sob, a high-pitched, theatrical wail that found no sympathy in the room. Jane tried to stand, her face contorted into a mask of snarling defiance, but my father's presence loomed over her like a shadow, silencing her with a single, cold look. The secret was out, and it was uglier than any of them had imagined. David tried to reach for me, his hands shaking, his voice a pathetic mumble of excuses, but I stepped back, the police finally moving in from the doorway. The finality of the law was the signal the community needed. As the officers approached to arrest David for the embezzlement and theft I had documented, the crowd finally broke. The festive atmosphere turned into a riot of moral outrage. A woman in the front row stood up and threw her half-empty water bottle at Marina, the plastic thudding against her chest. It was the first drop in a deluge. Suddenly, the air was filled with debris. The villagers, feeling used and insulted by the lies they had been fed, began to pelt the Mempelai with whatever was at hand. Cups of water, scraps of food, and the floral decorations they had worked so hard to put up were turned into weapons of shame. I watched as the white veil Marina was so proud of was stained with dirty water and discarded fruit. David tried to shield his face, crouching on the floor like the coward he had always been, while Jane screamed in the corner, her social ambitions dissolving into the dust of a village floor. I stood in the center of the chaos, the divorce decree still clutched in my hand, and felt a profound, chilling sense of peace. I didn't feel the need to join in the shouting or the throwing. My work was done. I had brought the truth to the one place David thought he was safe, and I had watched the world he tried to build for Marina crumble before it was even an hour old. The police led David and Jane away, their expensive clothes now tattered and wet, their dignity non-existent. Marina was left sitting on the floor, surrounded by the trash of the celebration she had stolen, her cries ignored by the people who had welcomed her just hours before. I turned and walked out of the hall, the sound of the villagers' anger fading behind me. My father was waiting by the car, and as I reached him, I handed him the decree. The wedding crasher had done more than just stop a ceremony, I had dismantled a delusion. As we drove away from the village, leaving the wreckage of David's life in the rearview mirror, I realized that the heavy weight I had been carrying for years was finally gone. The air was clear, the debt was paid, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back. The iron bars of the holding cell clinked with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the local precinct. I stood on the other side of that cold, gray barrier, watching the man I had once thought was my forever. David sat on a wooden bench, his head in his hands, the intricate batik shirt he had worn for his wedding now stained with the grime of the village floor and the sweat of a man who realized the walls were finally closing in. He looked smaller here, stripped of the expensive watches and the tailored suits that I had provided. Without the trappings of my wealth, he was just a hollow man with a desperate expression. Beside him, in a separate area for questioning, Marina was a specter of her former self. Her white veil had been discarded, lying on a plastic chair like a dead bird. The realization had finally begun to pierce through her delusions. She had spent months plotting to steal a life that she thought was paved with gold, only to find that she had tethered herself to a sinking ship. She had married a man who didn't just have no money, he had a massive, looming debt to the state and a criminal record that would follow him for decades. I watched her eyes dart around the room, wide and bloodshot, as she realized that the empire David had promised her was nothing more than a collection of stolen trinkets and embezzled funds. The jewelry was the final straw. It wasn't enough for David to drain the company accounts, he had reached into my personal safe, taking pieces that had belonged to my grandmother, heirlooms that carried the weight of generations. He had pawned my history to fund his betrayal. As the lead detective laid out the recovery report, detailing the shops where David had traded my memories for quick cash, I felt a surge of cold, sharp clarity. He hadn't just been a bad husband, he had been a scavenger, picking at the bones of my life while I was still living it. David looked up then, his eyes catching mine through the bars. For a moment, I saw the old David, the one who could conjure a tear on command and weave a story of misunderstood intentions. He stood up, his hands gripping the iron, and began to plead. His voice was a ragged whisper, a pathetic attempt to invoke the 5 years of history we shared. He spoke of one last chance, of making it right, and of the child Marina was carrying, as if that child were a shield he could hide behind. He tried to tell me that Jane had forced his hand, that he was a victim of his mother's greed. It was the most disgusting performance I had ever witnessed. I didn't answer him. I didn't scream, and I didn't offer the satisfaction of my anger. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out a clean, white envelope. It was the official divorce decree, the document that proved our legal separation had been finalized before he ever stepped foot in that village hall. I slid the papers through the gap in the bars. They fluttered to the floor of his cell, white and mocking against the dirty concrete. I told him, in a voice as calm as a winter morning, that he was no longer my husband, no longer my problem, and certainly no longer my equal. He was a stranger receiving a final notice. Watching him realize that he had committed bigamy, that his marriage to Marina was a legal farce and that he was now facing even more charges, was the most satisfying moment of the last 5 years. His knees buckled, and he sank back onto the bench, the paper clutched in his trembling hands. He had reached for my crown and ended up in the dust. The aftermath was a slow, quiet reconstruction. While David's legal battles began to pile up, leading to a lengthy prison sentence for embezzlement and grand theft, I returned to my life with a ferocity I didn't know I possessed. I purged the mansion of every trace of his presence. Every piece of furniture he had touched, every gift he had given me with my own money, was sold or donated. I reclaimed my name, my company, and most importantly, my peace. My father and I worked side by side to repair the financial damage, and within a year, the company was stronger than it had ever been. We were no longer a family haunted by a shadow, we were a fortress. But the most haunting part of the ending wasn't David's imprisonment. It was Marina. The stress of the public humiliation, the loss of the royal life she had coveted, and the abandonment by David as he tried to shift the blame onto her in court, proved too much for her mind to bear. The girl who had arrived at my door as a wolf in sheep's clothing had completely shattered. I heard through Backstreet that Marina had been moved to a psychiatric facility. She spent her days walking the halls of the ward, clutching a bundle of white fabric as if it were a wedding veil, talking to a David who was no longer there. She was trapped in the very moment of her greatest failure, a permanent resident of the disaster she had helped create. I felt a flicker of pity for her, the way one pities a broken glass, but I didn't let it take root. She had made her choices, and the mind is a fragile thing when built on a foundation of lies. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse a year later, the city lights stretching out below me like a sea of diamonds. The air was crisp, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the need to look over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for a lie to be told or a secret to be uncovered. I was Lucia, not a wife, not a victim, but a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her soul intact. My mother joined me on the balcony, handing me a glass of wine. We didn't talk about David. We didn't talk about the betrayal. We watched the moon rise over the skyline, silent and eternal. The price of silence had been high, but the freedom that followed was priceless. I had lost a husband, but I had found myself, and in the quiet of the night, I realized that was the greatest empire I could ever own. I was finally, truly, free. We hope today's story reminded you that no matter how deep the betrayal, your value remains unshaken. We truly believe that every voice matters, so please let us know your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments. It would mean the world to us. If you find comfort in these journeys of the heart, please consider subscribing to Mother's Story. Your presence here is a gift, and we are honored to have you with us.